Autumn, 1940. Britain is afraid. Not the private, shapeless fear of ordinary people lying awake at 3 a.m, though there is plenty of that too. This is something sharper, a specific institutional dread that has settled into the highest rooms of government and military intelligence like cold smoke. In the space of 6 weeks, German armour had torn through France so fast that seasoned generals simply stopped believing their own maps. The Low Countries fell in days. Dunkirk was a miracle wrapped in a catastrophe. And now, across that narrow grey channel, Hitler's armies stand on the cliffs of occupied France, and they are looking back. Britain knows what comes next. Or rather, Britain knows it must prepare for what comes next. Because before any invasion, any competent commander will tell you the same thing. You need intelligence. You need to know where the defences are, where the troops are massed, what the British are planning. You need eyes on the ground. And so, in the summer and autumn of 1940, Germany tried exactly that. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, dispatched a series of agents to the British Isles, trained, equipped, briefed. They carried forged identity papers, civilian clothing, wireless transmitters hidden in ordinary luggage. They had cover stories. They had maps. They had on paper everything they needed. The operation had a code name, Lena. It failed completely. Not gradually, not partially, completely. Every single agent was caught, some within hours of landing, some within days. MI5, stretched thin, working in conditions of near total secrecy, dismantled the entire German spy network on British soil with a thoroughness that left its own officers quietly stunned. There were many reasons for that success, some tactical, some structural, some owed to extraordinary good fortune. But one of the most remarkable reasons had nothing to do with codes, or surveillance, or double agents. It had to do with how the British ordered a round of drinks. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the country these agents were stepping into. Britain in 1940 was not a simple place to navigate, even for people born there. Wartime regulations had transformed the texture of everyday life in dozens of small, intricate ways. Rationing had rewritten the rules of food, fuel, clothing. Blackout regulations had altered the feel of streets and homes after dark. But beneath all of that, beneath the formal restrictions, lay something far harder to teach. A vast, invisible architecture of social behaviour. Unwritten rules, local customs, the thousand small signals by which the British identified one another as belonging. These weren't things you could find in a manual. You absorbed them over a lifetime without ever consciously registering them. They were invisible precisely because they were universal. Everyone knew them. Everyone did them. Everyone, that is, except a man who had learned about Britain from a training course in Hamburg. In 1940, the British pub was not simply a place to drink. It was the social nucleus of a community life. It was where information moved, where trust was established, where belonging was performed every single evening. It was also, for a German agent, an almost perfectly designed trap. The first problem was the beer itself. In Germany, you ordered a lager. You knew what you were getting. In Britain, the options were bewildering. Mild, bitter, stout, pale ale, each with its own glass, its own temperature, its own social weight. To walk up to a bar and ask simply for a beer was to announce in the clearest possible terms that you had never done this before. But even navigating the menu correctly, there was a second problem, and this one was subtler: the round. In British pub culture, you did not buy a drink for yourself alone. When drinking in company, each person in the group took turns buying for everyone. It was a system of reciprocal obligation, so deeply embedded in social custom that its absence was immediately conspicuous. A man who accepted drinks without offering to buy his own round was not just rude, he was wrong in a way that made people notice him. And noticing was the last thing a leaner agent could afford. Then there was the currency. Britain in 1940 used a monetary system that was, by any rational standard, baffling. Pounds, shillings, pence, halfpennies, non-decimal, non-intuitive, the product of centuries of accumulated custom rather than any guiding logic. For an agent trained in the clean, decimal arithmetic of the Reichsmark, handling British coins under pressure, at a bar with a publican and a dozen regulars watching, was an exercise in barely contained panic. They fumbled, they hesitated, people saw. But perhaps the most telling mistake, the one that has since become almost emblematic of the leaner operation, was the breakfast. One agent, Joseph Jacobs, transmitted a message back to Germany that included a request which baffled his handlers and amused British intelligence for years afterwards. He asked for, among other things, ham, eggs and beer for breakfast in Britain. In 1940, the British breakfast was a sacred institution with a strict internal grammar: bacon, eggs, sausage, toast, brown sauce or ketchup. You did not vary this formula, and you certainly did not accompany it with beer. The combination simply did not exist in the British culinary imagination. It was the kind of error that no cover story could survive. Even the sausage was a problem. In Germany, a sausage was a Wurst, firm, dense, flavourful. In wartime, Britain, a sausage was what rationing had made it, a mixture of breadcrumbs, soya, and optimism. An agent expecting one thing and receiving the other could not always control his expression. And his expression was data. What the Germans had not fully accounted for was the nature of the system that would be watching their agents. It was not purely MI5. It was not purely police. It was something far more distributed, and in some ways, far more formidable. It was the publicans, the shopkeepers, the railway staff, the Home Guard volunteers who had lived in these towns their whole lives and knew, instinctively, when something was off. Britain had, without formally designing it, constructed an informal early warning system built entirely out of community familiarity. A man who did not know the local customs was a man who radiated strangeness, and strangeness in the anxious autumn of 1940 was reported. The leaner agents were being observed not by trained intelligence officers, but by people who simply noticed that something didn't fit. There is something almost philosophical when you sit with it, about why the leaner operation failed so completely. The Abwehr had prepared its agents for the content of British life. The facts, the documents, the surface details. What it could not prepare them for was something far more fundamental, the lived texture of belonging to a culture. Culture is not a set of facts. It is a set of practices, absorbed over years without conscious effort until they become indistinguishable from instinct. An agent could know, intellectually, that the British ordered at the bar and not at the table. He could know about the round system. He could know the correct vocabulary, but knowing it and doing it smoothly, naturally, without the half-second pause of someone running through a mental checklist, are entirely different things. And that pause was visible, always. The British licensing laws made the problem worse. Under the Defence of the Realm Act, first passed in 1914 to stop munitions workers drinking during shifts, pub opening hours were strictly regulated in ways that bore no resemblance to anything on the continent. An agent who arrived at a pub expecting to be served and found it closed with no obvious explanation had already failed a test he didn't know he was taking. By the end of 1941, what had begun as a catastrophic failure for German intelligence had been transformed into something far more dangerous. For Germany. The double-cross system. MI5 had not simply arrested the leaner agents. In many cases, it had turned them, running them as double agents, feeding carefully constructed misinformation back to Berlin, through the very wireless sets the Abwehr had issued. Germany, for the most part, believed its spy network in Britain was intact and operational. It was not. Every message arriving at Abwehr headquarters from its agents in Britain had been written by British intelligence. The infrastructure for this triumph had been built, in part, on something as simple as a man who couldn't order a pint correctly. Because you cannot run a spy who is immediately arrested, an immediate arrest requires immediate detection. And immediate detection in 100 cases came down to a barman raising an eyebrow, a regular nudging his neighbour, a shopkeeper making a quiet phone call. None of the publicans who reported suspicious strangers in the autumn of 1940 received commendations. None of them filed intelligence reports. Most of them probably didn't think of themselves as doing anything more remarkable than mentioning to someone official that a man had come in, ordered strangely, fumbled his coins and sat in the wrong place. But the cumulative effect of those 1,000 small observations across 1,000 communities was the complete neutralization of German intelligence on British soil. What beats a spy ring is not always a better spy. Sometimes it is a way of life, so particular, so peculiar, so deeply specific, to a time and a place that no outsider can convincingly pretend to share it, not under the casual, unblinking scrutiny of people who have lived it every day of their lives. Germany sent trained agents, equipped agents, agents with wireless sets and cover stories and forged papers. Britain caught every single one of them, and somewhere in the quiet, warm fug of 1,000 English pubs, the barmen and the regulars did their bit, without ever knowing quite what they were part of, by doing the thing they had always done. They noticed the man who didn't quite fit. In Britain in 1940, knowing how to buy a round wasn't social etiquette. It was the difference between liberty and a cell. And the Germans never figured that out. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more awesome stories.